Grace Morrison stared at her phone screen, her vision slightly blurry from the wine she had consumed with her roommate that evening. Friday nights were sacred, a time to unwind after another exhausting week at Westbrook Industries. She typed furiously, pouring her heart out about her impossible crush on her impossibly handsome boss. The message was meant for her best friend Caroline. 3 paragraphs of confession about how Julian Westbrook made her heart race every time he walked past her desk, how his rare smiles felt like sunshine breaking through clouds, how she dreamed about running her fingers through his dark hair, how absolutely hopeless and foolish she felt for falling in love with a man so far out of her league. She hit send and collapsed into bed, feeling lighter for finally admitting the truth. The morning after disaster. Saturday morning arrived with cruel clarity. Grace woke to her phone buzzing insistently on her nightstand. Through squinted eyes, she saw 17 missed calls from Caroline and a string of messages in all caps. Her stomach dropped as she scrolled up to check her sent messages from last night. The blood drained from her face as reality crashed over her like ice water. The recipient name glowed mockingly on her screen. Julian Westbrook, not Caroline Chen. Julian Westbrook, she had sent her drunken love confession to her billionaire, CEO boss instead of her best friend, Grace. Spent the next hour alternating between pacing her small apartment and lying face down on her couch, contemplating whether she could possibly move to another country by Monday. Her career at Westbrook Industries was over. 3 years of hard work, late nights, and climbing the corporate ladder, all destroyed by one catastrophically misplaced text message. The summons Monday morning came too quickly. Grace dressed in her most professional outfit, a navy suit that made her feel armored against the humiliation awaiting her. She arrived at the office an hour early, hoping to avoid running into anyone, especially him. At exactly 9 o'clock, her phone rang. The executive assistant's crisp voice delivered the words Grace had been dreading. Julian Westbrook wanted to see her in his office immediately. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending to her own execution. Grace's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook, a useless prop since she knew this meeting had nothing to do with work. The executive suite smelled of expensive coffee and leather. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, a reminder of the vast distance between their worlds. Julian's assistant gestured toward the heavy oak door. Grace took a deep breath and knocked. The unexpected response. Julian Westbrook sat behind his massive desk, looking even more devastating than usual in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His expression was unreadable as he gestured for her to sit. Grace remained standing, her pride demanding she face her termination with dignity. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to beg for the chance to resign quietly, but he raised his hand, silencing her. His voice was deeper than she remembered, rich with an emotion she could not identify. He stood and walked around his desk, each step deliberate and measured. Grace's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. What he said next stopped her world from spinning. He told her about noticing her 2 years ago during a company presentation. How her passion for their marketing campaign had captivated him. How he found himself deliberately walking past her department just to see her smile. How he had read her message not once but a dozen times, unable to believe that she might feel the same impossible attraction he had been fighting. Grace felt her knees weaken. This could not be real. Men like Julian Westbrook did not fall for ordinary women like her. Yet here he stood, vulnerability written across his usually guarded features, confessing feelings that mirrored her own secret longings. A dangerous proposal. The air between them crackled with electricity. Julian moved closer, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He acknowledged every reason why they should not pursue this attraction. The power imbalance, the company policies, the potential scandal, the gossip that would consume them both. His words were logical, sensible, everything Grace's rational mind agreed with completely. Then he offered her a choice. They could pretend the message never existed, return to their professional roles, and bury these feelings forever. Or they could explore this connection carefully and privately, giving themselves permission to discover what might exist between them. Grace knew the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that protected her career and her heart from inevitable destruction. But standing there, looking into eyes that held the same longing she had hidden for years, safe suddenly seemed like the saddest word in the language. She chose danger. She chose possibility. She chose him. New rules for an old game. Julian's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of corporate seriousness. They established boundaries immediately. During work hours, they would maintain absolute professionalism. No lingering glances, no accidental touches, no favoritism that might raise suspicions. Outside the office, they would meet far from the city, in places where their faces meant nothing to strangers. Grace agreed to everything, her mind reeling from how completely her life had shifted in 72 hours. One drunken text message had torn down walls she thought were permanent, revealing a man who was somehow both the powerful CEO she admired and the vulnerable soul who understood loneliness, despite having everything. As she left his office, Grace caught her reflection in the polished elevator doors. She looked the same, but everything had changed. She had no idea that her accidental confession had set into motion events that would test everything she believed about love, worth, and the courage required to fight for happiness against impossible odds. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than either of them could imagine. The restaurant Julian chose for their first real date sat nestled in a quiet village 3 hours north of the city. Grace had changed outfits 5 times, finally settling on a deep green dress that made her feel confident without trying too hard. She met him in an underground parking garage, slipping into his car like they were starring in some romantic thriller. The drive became its own adventure. They talked about everything except work, discovering each other beyond the corporate masks they wore daily. Julian spoke about his childhood in Philadelphia, the weight of inheriting his grandfather's empire at 28, the isolation that came with wealth and power. Grace shared stories about growing up in a small coastal town in Maine, her dreams of proving herself in the corporate world, and her close bond with her twin brother who taught high school English. The restaurant glowed with candlelight and intimacy. Julian had reserved a private corner table where they could talk without worrying about being overheard or recognized. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in months, discovering that beneath his serious executive exterior, Julian possessed a dry wit and surprising vulnerability. He told her about his failed engagement 5 years earlier, a relationship that crumbled under the pressure of his demanding career and her family's expectations. Grace shared her own history of disappointing relationships, with men who felt threatened by her ambition or expected her to diminish herself to make them comfortable, building something real there. Connection deepened with each stolen evening together. They explored art museums in Connecticut, walked through botanical gardens in New Jersey, and spent long afternoons in bookstores where nobody knew their names. Julian was brilliant and driven, but Grace discovered layers of kindness and humor that he kept hidden from the business world. He remembered small details she mentioned in passing. Her favorite flowers appeared at her apartment with no card, just his familiar handwriting on a small note. He sent her book recommendations that perfectly matched her taste. When she mentioned missing the ocean, he surprised her with a weekend trip to a quiet beach town where they walked along the shore at sunset, talking about everything and nothing. Grace found herself falling deeper than she ever intended. This was not just attraction or the thrill of a forbidden romance. This was something profound and terrifying, the kind of love that could either build her up or completely destroy her. The delicate dance, maintaining their secret at work, required constant vigilance and Oscar-worthy performances. Grace and Julian addressed each other with formal politeness in meetings. They kept physical distance in hallways and elevators. Every interaction was carefully measured to reveal nothing of the truth burning beneath the surface. But underneath the professional facade, every moment crackled with hidden meaning. When Julian asked her to review a proposal after hours, they would work diligently for exactly 1 hour before giving in to kisses that left them both breathless. When their hands brushed accidentally while passing documents, the jolt of electricity was enough to sustain Grace through entire days of forced distance. They developed a private language of subtle gestures. A specific way Julian adjusted his tie meant he was thinking about her. When Grace tucked her hair behind her left ear, it was her signal that she wished they were alone. These tiny communications became lifelines, reminders that their secret world existed even in the harsh fluorescent reality of corporate life. Whispers in the shadows, the first signs of trouble appeared gradually, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Grace began noticing colleagues watching her more closely. Conversations would stop abruptly when she entered break rooms. Her friend and co-worker Beth started asking pointed questions about why Grace was always unavailable for after-work drinks lately. Grace tried dismissing her paranoia as guilt manifesting as suspicion. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, delivering exceptional results on every project. But the uncomfortable feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger each day. Julian noticed it too. They discussed the situation during a late dinner at their favorite hideaway restaurant. He wanted to be more careful, to increase the distance between them at work. Grace agreed intellectually, but felt her heart protest at the idea of even fewer moments together. The anonymous warning. The threatening note arrived on a Tuesday evening. Grace found it slipped under her apartment door when she returned home from a late meeting. Plain white paper, impersonal printed text, words that made her blood run cold. Everyone at Westbrook Industries knows about you and Julian. Stop this inappropriate relationship before you embarrass yourself and damage his reputation. Women from your background do not belong with men like him. This is your only warning. Grace's hands shook as she read the message 3 times, each word cutting deeper. Someone had been watching them despite all their precautions. Someone knew their secret and had taken the time to track down her home address. The violation felt intimate and frightening. She called Julian immediately, her voice trembling as she read him the note. His response was instantaneous and fierce. He told her to lock her doors and windows, that he was coming over right away, that they would handle this together. Sanctuary in small spaces, 20 minutes later. Julian stood in her modest apartment for the first time. The contrast between their worlds had never been more apparent. Her second-hand furniture and tiny kitchen were a universe away from his penthouse with its designer everything and panoramic views. But he did not seem to notice or care about the difference. He pulled her into his arms, holding her until her trembling stopped. They sat together on her worn couch, the threatening note on the coffee table between them like a venomous snake. Julian's jaw was tight with barely controlled anger, not at her, but at whoever had violated their privacy and tried to intimidate her. Grace felt something shift inside her as she watched him. This powerful man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions without flinching was sitting in her cramped living room, looking at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. The note had been meant to scare her away, to remind her she did not belong in his sphere. Instead, it crystallized something she had been trying not to acknowledge. She loved him completely, desperately, in a way that transcended logic or self-preservation. And looking at the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, she knew without doubt that he loved her too. Crossing the line, they talked until nearly midnight, trying to figure out who might have sent the note and what their next steps should be. Julian wanted to hire a private investigator. Grace worried that would only escalate the situation and draw more attention to their relationship. Finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, they simply held each other. Julian stroked her hair, murmuring promises that he would not let anyone hurt her or drive them apart. Grace pressed her face against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, drawing strength from his certainty. When he finally left, promising to call her the moment he got home, Grace sat alone in her apartment and made a decision. She refused to be intimidated or shamed for loving someone. She refused to believe that her ordinary background made her unworthy of extraordinary love. The note had been meant to end their relationship. Instead, it had revealed just how far they were both willing to go to protect what they had built together. The game had shifted from secret romance to something more serious, and Grace was done playing defense. Tomorrow, she would figure out who wanted to destroy her happiness and why. Tonight, she allowed herself to simply feel grateful for finding a love worth fighting for, even when the whole world seemed determined to tear them apart. The investigation began quietly. Julian hired a discreet security consultant who reviewed building access logs and security footage. Grace started paying closer attention to her co-workers, watching for signs of hostility or unusual interest in her personal life. The answer came from an unexpected source. Beth cornered Grace in the women's restroom on Thursday afternoon, her expression troubled. She confessed that Victoria Ashford, the senior vice president of operations and Julian's former fiancée, had been asking pointed questions about Grace for weeks. Victoria had ended things with Julian 5 years ago to marry a European aristocrat, but her marriage had recently collapsed. She had returned to Westbrook Industries 6 months earlier, clearly hoping to rekindle her relationship with Julian. Grace felt pieces clicking into place. Victoria had the access, the motivation, and the vindictive personality to orchestrate the threatening note. She also had significant influence within the company and connections to board members who already questioned Julian's leadership decisions. When Grace shared this information with Julian that evening, his expression turned thunderous. He admitted that Victoria had been making subtle advances since her return, advances he had firmly rejected. He had not mentioned it because he considered it handled, never imagining she would target Grace directly. The impossible choice. That weekend, Julian invited Grace to his penthouse for the first time. The space was stunning, all modern architecture and expensive art, but also surprisingly warm. Photographs of his family lined one shelf, and well-worn books filled an entire wall. This was not just a showplace, but a home where someone actually lived. They cooked dinner together, something simple and domestic that felt profoundly intimate. As they sat on his balcony overlooking the glittering city, Julian took her hand and spoke words that changed everything. He told her he loved her. Not in some distant future tense, but right now, completely and irrevocably. He said he was tired of hiding, tired of pretending she meant nothing to him when she meant everything. He wanted to go public with their relationship, to face whatever consequences came together rather than continuing to live in shadows. Grace's heart soared and plummeted simultaneously. She loved him too, had loved him for longer than she wanted to admit. But going public meant exposing themselves to judgment, gossip, and potential professional destruction. It meant facing Victoria's wrath and the board's disapproval. It meant risking everything they had both worked so hard to build. Julian understood her fears because he shared them, but he was done letting fear dictate his happiness. He had spent years being the perfect CEO, making every decision based on logic and company interests. For once, he wanted to choose his heart over his career. He wanted to choose her. The board meeting showdown Monday morning brought an emergency board meeting. Victoria had apparently spent the weekend building her case, convincing several conservative board members that Julian's relationship with a subordinate created liability issues and reflected poor judgment. She framed it as concern for company integrity, but her true motivation was transparent to anyone paying attention. Julian asked Grace to attend the meeting with him. She dressed in her most professional suit, armor against the battle ahead. As they walked into that boardroom together, making no effort to hide their connection, Grace felt both terrified and liberated. The board members' reactions ranged from surprise to disapproval to barely concealed hostility. Victoria sat at the far end of the table, her expression radiating false concern wrapped around genuine malice. She had orchestrated this confrontation expecting Julian to either deny the relationship or end it to protect his position. She had miscalculated completely. Julian addressed the board with the same commanding presence he brought to every business presentation. He acknowledged his relationship with Grace openly and without apology. He explained that they had maintained complete professionalism at work, that Grace had received no special treatment or advantages, and that their personal relationship had zero impact on company operations. Then he said something that made Grace's throat tighten with emotion. He told the board that Grace Morrison was the most talented marketing analyst the company had employed in a decade. Her campaigns had increased revenue by 30% over 3 years. Her insights had shaped their most successful product launches. If the board wanted to question anyone's judgment, they should question their own for not recognizing her value sooner. Grace finds her voice. Victoria attempted to interrupt, to steer the conversation back to policy violations and inappropriate conduct. But Grace had remained silent long enough. She stood, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She addressed the board directly, laying out her qualifications, her accomplishments, and her contributions to Westbrook Industries. She acknowledged that falling in love with Julian had been unplanned and complicated, but she refused to apologize for it or pretend it was wrong. She had worked too hard and proven herself too thoroughly to accept being dismissed as some inappropriate distraction. Then she turned to Victoria, meeting her hostile gaze without flinching. Grace spoke calmly but firmly, noting that anonymous threatening notes and behind-the-scenes manipulation revealed far more about Victoria's character than any consensual relationship between two adults ever could. If Victoria had legitimate concerns about company policy, she should have raised them through proper channels rather than resorting to intimidation tactics. The room fell silent. Several board members looked uncomfortable, clearly reassessing the situation. Victoria's face flushed with anger and embarrassment at being called out so directly, the declaration that changed everything. Julian stood beside Grace, his hand finding hers in full view of everyone present. He made his position crystal clear. He loved Grace Morrison and intended to build a life with her. If the board considered that grounds for his removal as CEO, he would accept their decision and step down. But he would not end his relationship, would not hide his feelings, and would not allow anyone to treat Grace as though she were somehow unworthy or inappropriate. The power in that moment was breathtaking. Julian Westbrook, billionaire CEO, was willing to sacrifice his position, his legacy, everything he had built, for love. For her, but he was not finished. He proposed a solution that demonstrated why he had been so successful in business. Grace would transfer to a different department, reporting to someone other than him, eliminating any direct supervisory relationship. They would sign agreements acknowledging their relationship and waiving any future claims of favoritism or misconduct. They would be transparent rather than secretive, removing any ammunition for gossip or scandal. The board members exchanged glances. Several nodded slowly. Even those who disapproved of the relationship had to acknowledge that Julian's proposal addressed their legitimate concerns while refusing to compromise on the fundamental issue. Love conquers. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The board accepted Julian's proposal with conditions about transparency and regular reviews. Victoria, realizing she had lost completely, resigned effective immediately, unable to face the humiliation of watching Julian build a life with someone else. As they left the boardroom, Grace felt lighter than she had in months. The secret was out, the threat was neutralized, and they had survived. More than survived, they had won by refusing to compromise their integrity or their love. Julian pulled her into an empty conference room, his hands framing her face as he kissed her with a passion no longer constrained by secrecy or fear. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, he whispered words that made her heart sing. He told her she was magnificent, that watching her stand up for herself and for them had been one of the proudest moments of his life. He had fallen in love with her talent and determination, but seeing her courage today had deepened that love into something unshakable. 6 months later, Grace Morrison stood in Julian's penthouse, now officially their shared home, looking at the ring on her finger. It was elegant and understated, much like their journey together. They had faced judgment and overcome obstacles. They had proven that love between two people from different worlds was not only possible, but powerful. The office gossip had eventually faded, replaced by respect as people witnessed their professionalism and genuine partnership. Grace's transfer to the strategy department had actually enhanced her career, giving her new challenges and opportunities to shine. Julian continued leading Westbrook Industries with the same brilliance that had always defined him, but with a new lightness that came from no longer carrying his heart in secret. They had learned that sometimes the most courageous thing anyone can do is choose love openly, without apology or compromise. That true partnership means standing beside someone through battles, not hiding from conflict. That worth is not measured by background or bank accounts, but by character, courage, and the willingness to fight for what matters most. Grace's accidental text message had sparked a chain of events that transformed both their lives. What began as a drunken confession had evolved into a love story that proved the best relationships are not the easiest ones, but the ones worth fighting for. Together they had faced their fears, defeated their enemies, and built something beautiful from the ashes of secrecy and shame. As Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple while they watched the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and crimson, Grace smiled. She had sent that message to the wrong person, or perhaps to exactly the right person after all. Sometimes the best destinations are the ones we stumble into accidentally, and the greatest loves are the ones we are brave enough to fight for against all odds. Their story was not about a billionaire rescuing an ordinary woman. It was about two people choosing each other despite the obstacles, building a partnership based on mutual respect and unwavering support. It was about refusing to let society's rules dictate matters of the heart, and discovering that real love requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to stand together when the whole world tries to tear you apart. The accidental text had changed everything, but their choice to fight for each other had created a love without limits.